I came home one morning and froze. There it was, a massive sparkling community pool, right on my property. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. The HOA had just bulldozed a chunk of my land without asking. I felt anger, disbelief, little fear, but then a wild idea hit me, something I never thought I'd actually do. Could I really get away with turning their shiny little paradise into something completely absurd? Something they'd never forget. What I did next changed everything. I've lived on this little slice of land for nearly a decade, the kind of place where mornings start with the smell of fresh-cut grass and evenings drift into quiet sunsets over our backyard. My kids ran barefoot across the lawn, the dog chased squirrels, and for once, it felt like our home was truly ours, untouched by rules, regulations, or nosy neighbors. That calm bubble, however, existed just outside the reach of our HOA. Officially, they're the community association, but in practice, they're a league of people who get a strange thrill out of enforcing arbitrary rules
that's
and
too close to the
meddling in
pool.
everyone else's
Sir, the plans
business.
show this is fine.
Meetings,
I don't care,
letters,
you're fixing this now.
reminders. Nothing was too small for them to scrutinize. At first, I kept my distance. I figured, as long as I followed their rules, we'd be fine. Then came the notice that started it all, a proposal for a new community amenity. I skimmed the brochure, expecting the usual tennis court or playground upgrade. That's when I saw it, the map showing a sparkling blue rectangle creeping right onto the edge of my property. My jaw dropped. According to the HOA, a tiny corner of my land, my grass, my trees, my private backyard, was now part of the community pool area. They claimed it was just a formality, an easement. But to me, it felt like an outright theft. I spent the next few days trying to wrap my head around it. How could this happen? How could someone just decide my land was theirs without even asking? Every time I called the HOA, I got polite smiles, legal jargon, and a shrug that said, "Too bad, so sad." It was official. A fight was coming, and I knew one thing for sure. There was no way I'd let them waltz onto my property without consequences. It started small, almost laughably so. At first, I thought maybe it was a clerical error, a stray survey line, a misfiled map. But when I saw the surveyor stakes lining the edge of my property, I knew it wasn't a mistake. They had gone ahead with the construction. My own backyard had been quietly annexed. I walked along the edge, trying to imagine a pool where my garden used to bloom, where my kids had spent hours building forts. The water glinted in the morning, sun taunting me. It was surreal, like watching someone rearrange your furniture while you were still sleeping. I called the HOA, trying to reason with them. "Excuse me, this is my land," I said. The response was a rehearsed calm. "Our documents are in order. The corner in question falls under the community easement. We're happy to discuss details at the next board meeting." They sounded friendly enough, almost cheerful. But there was a cold finality behind the words, a bureaucratic shrug that said, "We don't need your permission." I hung up, stomach churning, realizing that this wasn't just about a pool, it was about control. The first confrontation came a week later when I walked outside and caught one of the HOA's contractors leveling the last section of lawn. Stepped forward, hands on hips, trying to appear calm. "You need to stop. This is my property." The man looked at me, expressionless. "I have instructions," he said, "from the HOA." "And who authorized those instructions?" I asked. "They did," he replied. "That's all I know. It was absurd." I was arguing with a stranger who had no power of his own, while the real threat hid behind stacks of bylaws and meeting minutes untouchable in their office. I could feel anger simmering, but more than that, helplessness. That night I began my own investigation. I pulled old survey maps, property deeds, emails, and HOA bylaws. The more I dug, the stranger it became. Some easement notes were vague or contradictory. Other documents seemed to have been added after the fact. I even found photos online from a neighbor's security camera, clear footage of workers trampling my flower beds and digging up the grass, while no formal notice was posted to me. My jaw dropped. This was not oversight, this was deliberate overreach. The harassment escalated quickly after that. The HOA sent a series of increasingly passive-aggressive letters. First, a reminder that my mailbox was over the limit of landscaping decor. Then, a warning that unapproved activities on my property could incur fines. The words were polite but pointed, every line dripping with the power imbalance I could feel but couldn't yet fight. One letter even implied that if I resisted, they might involve legal counsel to ensure compliance. My mailbox had become a daily source of dread. Neighbors started acting strangely too. Some offered sympathy but stayed distant. Others whispered behind hands, unsure where their loyalty lay. And then I noticed something else. Subtle surveillance. A van parked across the street one afternoon, tinted windows reflecting my living room. I couldn't be sure it was the HOA, but after a few more days of seeing the same vehicle, my stomach knotted. They were watching. Every move I made was being monitored, catalogued, and possibly used against me. And yet, amid the frustration, I found small victories that kept the fire alive. I began documenting everything meticulously. Photos of the property lines, time-stamped videos of the pool encroachment, screenshots of all correspondence. Every letter, every conversation, every suspicious van became a piece of evidence. I realized that while they had power over construction crews and bylaws, I had the power of truth. One morning I received an email that felt almost like a provocation. The subject line read, "Final notice, community pool easement compliance." I opened IAS, it slowly heart racing. The contents were a thinly veiled threat. Failure to comply would result in fines and potential legal action. I sat back, thinking of the pool, my backyard, transformed without my consent. And then a thought struck me. What if I could reclaim the space in a way that was unmistakable, undeniable, and just a little absurd? I didn't act immediately. I spent days imagining every possible response, calling lawyers, filing complaints, staging protests. But every conventional option felt slow, ineffective, and impotent against the mountain of HOA bureaucracy. I needed something more immediate, more visible, a way to send a message without leaving a shred of doubt about whose land this really was. By the end of that week, the stakes had escalated to a personal obsession. I watched the pool every morning, noticing the way the water rippled across my grass, the way the sunlight made it look almost serene, almost inviting, as if daring me to interfere. And then, while I was reviewing my property lines one evening, I noticed something odd. The pool's edge didn't match the legal plans the HOA had submitted. A small section, barely noticeable, jutted further onto my property than any easement allowed. It was minor, almost laughable in scale, but it felt like a crack in their armor. A small mistake that might just give me leverage. It was the perfect opening. A minor oversight buried in layers of legalese that no one had bothered to double-check. The realization hit me with a mix of thrill and disbelief. If I could exploit it, even slightly, I could reclaim some control. I could prove that the rules weren't absolute and that I wasn't powerless. By the following morning, I had a plan forming in my mind. Not reckless, not illegal, but bold enough to get their attention. The first step was simple. Gather evidence of the overreach, document everything meticulously, and then prepare for the moment when action would be unavoidable. Every day I waited, tension built. Every letter, every glance from a neighbor, every suspicious vehicle only added fuel to the fire. It all came to a head one afternoon when the HOA board president decided to pay an unannounced visit. He arrived, clipboard in hand, ready to lecture me about compliance. I let him speak, smiling politely while mentally cataloging every word, every gesture. When he finished, I leaned on the fence and asked a single, pointed question. "Do you really believe you can just take someone's land and expect no consequences?" He blinked, taken aback, clearly unprepared for confrontation. That pause, that fleeting moment of uncertainty, was all I needed to feel the scales tipping. For the first time, I realized this battle wasn't entirely in their hands, and so, the pieces were in place. The investigation had revealed their errors. The harassment had escalated beyond polite warning, and the small victory, a crack in their carefully constructed bureaucracy, had emerged. The question now wasn't if I would act, but how. Every nerve in my body knew the next move would define the outcome. The tension was unbearable, but exhilarating. Little did they know, the payoff would be both satisfying and absurd. A perfect blend of poetic justice. But to get there, I had to wait for the right moment, to let the suspense build until the HOA, the neighbors, and even I couldn't anticipate exactly what would happen next. The morning I decided to act, the sun was barely over the horizon. My backyard, once serene, looked like a miniature war zone, half my grass buried under construction debris, the pool sparkling deceptively in the dawn light. I took a deep breath, feeling the mix of adrenaline and disbelief. I'd spent weeks documenting everything, preparing for this moment, imagining every possible reaction, and now there was no turning back. First, I had to reclaim control. I grabbed the garden hose and started siphoning water, inch by inch, out of the pool. It was slower than I anticipated. Each gallon drained felt like a small victory, a rebellion against the bureaucracy that had swallowed my property. As the water level dropped, I imagined the faces of the HOA board members when they realized that their community amenity was no longer usable. I smiled despite the early hour. There was a strange satisfaction in this quiet, methodical defiance. Neighbors began to peek from behind curtains, their whispers floating over the fence. Some looked horrified, others barely hid their amusement. I ignored them. My focus was on the pool, on reclaiming my land inch by inch. I'd rigged a small temporary barrier to redirect the remaining water toward a shallow trench I'd dug along the edge, ensuring that nothing I did would cause structural damage or violate local codes. This wasn't about breaking the law. It was about reclaiming dignity. By late morning, the pool was half empty. I grabbed an old trough we had stored in the barn for emergencies and began positioning it at the far end of my reclaimed property. Step by step, I transferred buckets of water, carefully ensuring that the transformation would be complete and unmistakable. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on me. What had once been a gleaming luxury community pool was now being repurposed as a makeshift cattle trough. The first HOA member arrived unannounced, striding across the sidewalk with clipped professionalism. He stopped in his tracks, eyes widening as he took in the scene. Water sloshing gently in a trough, empty pool glinting behind him, and me, calmly sipping coffee as if nothing extraordinary was happening. What are you doing?" he asked, voice a mix of outrage and confusion. "I'm reclaiming my land," I said simply. "Legally, ethically, finally." He sputtered, looking around for support, perhaps hoping some hidden rule would rescue him. But there was none. Every document I had collected, every photo, every time-stamped video, had built a solid, irrefutable case that this corner of land belonged to me. And now it looked like my small act of defiance had both symbolic and literal impact. By noon, the water had been fully transferred. The pool sat empty, its clean blue tiles reflecting the sun with ironic mockery, while the trough gleamed under the same light, a symbol of my small but decisive victory. I could see the anger in the eyes of the HOA members as they gathered. Flustered and uncertain, they hadn't anticipated creativity, patience, or audacity, only compliance. Neighbors began to trickle outside, cameras in hand. Some clapped quietly, others laughed outright. I felt an unexpected surge of solidarity, a sense that the absurdity of the situation had brought the whole street into my corner. The HOA, for all its authority, looked powerless, constrained by its own rigid rulebook while I stood on my land, calm but triumphant. I could feel my pulse racing as I surveyed the scene. The hours of frustration, letters, surveillance, and intimidation had all led to this one moment, the moment when the balance of power finally shifted. It wasn't just about water in a trough or an empty pool. It was about asserting boundaries, taking action when words failed, and exposing the ridiculousness of unchecked authority. One board member finally muttered, "This isn't permanent, is it?" I shrugged, smiling faintly. "It is now," I said. The words carried more weight than I realized. Finality, defiance, and irony all in one. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match. The victory was quiet, absurd, and unmistakable. The visual proof of my actions, the emptied pool and repurposed trough, was more effective than any legal argument or angry letter. As the sun reached its zenith, I stepped back, surveying the transformed scene. The cows from the neighbors' small hobby farm wandered over curiously, sniffing at the trough. A laugh escaped me, part relief, part disbelief. The absurdity, the small poetic justice, was perfect. I had turned bureaucracy into a spectacle of logic and practicality, and yet, even as the adrenaline faded, I felt a new tension, a subtle awareness that this was only one chapter. The HOA could respond, the letters could continue, lawyers might still get involved. But for now, in this precise moment, I had reclaimed my land, my dignity, and a sense of control that bureaucracy had tried to strip away. I poured myself a glass of water from the trough, raising it like a toast. "Here's to boundaries," I said quietly, to no one in particular. And just like that, the story of overreach, intimidation, and absurd conflict had reached its emotional peak. The water sloshed gently, the cows ambled closer, and the HOA members exchanged glances that were equal parts outrage and disbelief. It was over, at least for now, but the impact would ripple through the neighborhood for weeks, maybe months. Every inch of that repurposed pool told a story of patience, ingenuity, and quiet defiance. Every splash from the trough whispered, "I will not be ignored, I will not be bullied, and I will find a way to make justice both fair and, yes, ridiculous." The sun dipped toward afternoon, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't known in weeks. My home was mine again, in a way that words could never have conveyed. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Sometimes the most effective response isn't yelling, isn't litigation. It's cleverness, timing, and a willingness to embrace the absurd. I glanced back at the empty pool and the full trough, letting the scene sink in. The HOA had underestimated me. They had assumed compliance. But now, they were witnesses to a truth that was impossible to ignore. My land, my rules, my victory. And just like that, the tension began to shift, moving slowly toward reflection, aftermath, and a story that neighbors would talk about for years. But for now, for this exact moment, the rebellion was complete. The days after the incident were quiet, almost eerily so. The HOA seemed frozen in disbelief, unsure how to respond to a situation that had escaped every protocol and rule they had carefully written to maintain control. Letters arrived, of course, polite but clipped reminders about compliance, hints at fines, and veiled warnings about legal action. But the tone had shifted. There was hesitation now, a recognition that their authority had limits when faced with patience, creativity, and a little absurdity. Neighbors were the first to respond in earnest. Some stopped by to see the trough, cameras in hand, curious and amused. A few laughed outright, unable to contain the absurdity, a community pool converted into a cattle trough, right on what was once private land. Others simply nodded in quiet approval, silently acknowledging the small victory. I realized then that the act had not just reclaimed my property, it had subtly shifted the balance of respect in the neighborhood. People were no longer just observing the HOA's power. They were seeing that it could be challenged, that fairness and common sense still mattered. The cows became a daily spectacle. Every morning I'd watch them amble over, sniffing and occasionally splashing in the water, their calm acceptance a perfect contrast to the chaos that had consumed the HOA. There was humor in it, certainly, but there was also a subtle lesson. Nature doesn't follow bylaws, and neither should the human spirit be bound entirely by rigid authority. I began sharing small updates with neighbors, not to brag, but to celebrate the absurdity and the small justice of it all. Interestingly, the HOA's power plays began to lose steam. Without compliance, without spectacle, without visible control, their threats felt hollow. Meetings that once demanded attendance now had empty chairs. Letters were met with polite but firm replies pointing out their overreach and documented evidence. I had learned something vital. Patience, preparation, and a well-timed response could level the playing field. Bureaucracy could be challenged, even dismantled, without a single lawsuit, or at least without escalating immediately to one. Emotionally, the experience left a strange mix of satisfaction and reflection. I had spent weeks oscillating between anger, anxiety, and disbelief. And yet the act itself, transforming the pool into a trough, was surprisingly peaceful in execution. There had been no confrontation, no shouting, no public spectacle beyond the quiet amusement of neighbors, just a deliberate, clever reclamation of what was mine. And in that quiet, absurd victory, I found something deeper. The realization that standing up for your boundaries doesn't always require aggression. Sometimes it requires imagination. Months later, the scene became part of neighborhood lore. Children pointed at the trough and laughed. Neighbors would whisper to newcomers about the pool that became a trough. Even the HOA seemed reluctant to mention it, as if acknowledging it would undermine the authority they clung to so desperately. I had become, in a small but meaningful way, a symbol of measured defiance and clever problem-solving. The practical impact was simple. The land was mine, fully restored, and fully respected. The HOA no longer dared to cross that boundary, at least not without scrutiny, evidence, and a careful awareness that their actions could be creatively countered. But beyond property lines and bylaws, there was a broader, more lasting effect, a subtle shift in the neighborhood's understanding of fairness, power, and accountability. People had witnessed a balance restored, not through confrontation alone, but through ingenuity and calm resolve. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the cows linger by the trough, I thought about the absurdity and the lessons alike. Bureaucracy can feel immovable, its rules cold and rigid, but it is ultimately human-made and therefore fallible. Authority demands respect, but it should never demand submission. And sometimes the smallest act, careful, deliberate, and a touch ridiculous, can remind everyone that fairness and creativity still have a place in the world. I also reflected on the personal journey, the fear of confrontation, the hours of documentation, the anxiety of being watched or challenged. Each of these moments had tested me, but each had also built confidence. I had learned patience, the value of evidence, and the subtle power of irony. And while the HOA might still attempt other overreaches in the future, I now knew that any attempt could be met with preparation, wit, and a calm assertion of rights. Looking back, the pool, and the trough it became, was more than a physical transformation. It was a narrative of empowerment, of reclaiming control in the face of absurd authority, and of turning frustration into action that was clever, ethical, and lasting. And as the sun set behind my backyard, casting long shadows across the transformed land, I realized something simple yet profound. Victory isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just quiet, absurd, and undeniably yours. And I couldn't help but wonder, with a small smile, how many battles in life are waiting for us to approach them, not with anger, but with patience, creativity, and the courage to reclaim what's rightfully ours. The answer isn't in yelling or compliance. It's in strategy, persistence, and a little touch of audacity. As the cows sipped the water in the trough, as the sun dipped lower, and as the neighborhood buzzed with quiet gossip, I felt a deep sense of closure. The conflict had ended, the land was secure, and the lesson was clear. Boundaries, fairness, and common sense matter, and sometimes standing up for them can be both absurd and perfect. The story wasn't just about a pool. It was about resilience, ingenuity, and the small, satisfying justice that comes from asserting control in a world that often feels designed to take it away. And in that realization, I found peace, laughter, and perhaps most importantly, empowerment, the kind that lasts far longer than any HOA letter ever could.